After days of beefing up his anti-immigration rhetoric, the president announced Thursday he plans to limit U.S. asylum policy. This comes in response to the caravan of Central American migrants continuing toward the U.S. Although it is still weeks away, the president says he's not taking any chances. In a news conference, he claimed there's been, quote, rampant abuse of the asylum seeker program. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett has the latest.
This is an invasion, and nobody's even questioning that.
Late this afternoon, President Trump said he will use executive authority to ban asylum seekers from entering the U.S. unless they surrender at a port of entry.
Under this plan, the illegal aliens will no longer get a free pass into our country by lodging meritless claims in seeking asylum.
Under the previous policy, migrants making asylum claims were permitted to stay in the U.S. while their cases were processed, regardless of where they entered.
We're not releasing them into our country any longer. They'll wait for long periods of time.
The U.S. granted asylum in 2016 to more than 20,000 immigrants who faced persecution or violence in their home nations. The new policy comes as Mr. Trump hardens his stance on immigration a week before the midterm elections. More than 5,000 active-duty military are headed to the southern border to support National Guard and Border Patrol efforts. The president suggested last night that number could triple. The U.S. military, the president said, would use lethal force if migrants throw rocks.
We will consider that a firearm, because there's not much difference when you get hit in the face with a rock. Consider it a rifle.
The president also tweeted this profanity-laced web ad that shows Luis Bracamontes, an illegal immigrant from Mexico who was convicted of killing 2 police officers in 2014. The accusation, Democrats are soft on immigration and crime. Bracamontes was deported from the U.S. twice, once under Bill Clinton and once under George W. Bush.
One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery stabbing.
The spot drew comparisons to the 1988 Willie Horton ad produced by allies of George H.W. Bush, which painted his opponent, then Democratic nominee Michael Dukakis, as soft on crime. Critics called it a racially charged attack. In an interview last night aboard Air Force One, the president dismissed charges of racism.
Anytime a Republican is leading, they take out the R word, the racist word. And I'm not anti-immigrant at all. I'm all for people coming into the country legally and people based on merit.
Tennessee Republican Bob Corker, retiring from the Senate in January, said the president is using immigration to his political benefit.
What's happening? It's all about revving up the base and using fear to stimulate people coming out at the polls.
And Major Garrett joins me now. He's traveling with the president in Columbia, Missouri. Hi, Major. What kind of political blowback is the president receiving from both sides of the aisle for his latest proposal regarding asylum seekers?
Well, let's take Senator Bob Corker, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He is leaving the Senate. He's been an oftentimes well-quoted critic of President Trump. But he basically just said this is about a base mobilization strategy, stoking fear, stoking resentment, stoking a sense of anxiety about the other, the migrants who are coming to America by whatever means. And when the president says he's all in favor of immigrants applying for entry into the United States legally, well, that's what under U.S. law asylum seekers do. They go through a process, and it's not an easy process. They have to establish through various means that either persecution or violence is such a pronounced threat, possibly grave threat to their lives, that they have qualified for asylum in the United States. Nevertheless, the president has said this executive authority he intends to use will require asylum seekers only to go through that legal process at a port of entry. Now, critics of what the president announced today, largely on the pro-immigrant left side of the political spectrum, have accused him of 2 things. 1, lying about the circumstances most asylum seekers live with, and 2, trampling on existing U.S. law and international agreements about how to deal with migrants and or refugees seeking asylum in lots of different countries, among them the United States. So there's a political strategy. There's also legal hurdles that this executive action quite clearly will face, and the critics came out almost immediately saying The president can say these things. It doesn't make them A, true, or B, legal. A fight ahead is certainly coming.
Now, Major, as you pointed out in your piece, in terms of a political strategy, it's certainly been done before, fomenting this fear against an idea of Democrats supporting looser borders. But does this time around feel a little different? I mean, the president said Wednesday he's prepared to deploy up to 15,000 troops to stop that migrant caravan. So, number one, what would that many troops do at once if they arrive at the border?
Well, what the U.S. military is there to do under its existing orders is provide support to Border Patrol, Immigration Customs Enforcement. Only provide support, logistical and otherwise, not engage directly under the existing orders with any migrants who might come to the border seeking entry by whatever means, asylum or some other means. So it's a support role, but does it have an optic power larger than that support role? Absolutely. And one of the rationales, and trust me, Trump supporters behind me believe it's a powerful and important rationale, is to send a signal to the migrant caravans, turn around, don't come. Because you're not just going to meet Border Patrol and immigration, you're going to meet the U.S. military. So as a deterrent, symbolically, the White House believes it's important and valid.
Right.
And there is certainly something to the optics of deploying the U.S. military to deter a large migrant caravan. And Trump supporters, I can guarantee you, believe that's the right idea and the right policy. This announcement today on asylum seekers is quite different. It's trying to change the way this process works. It's a legally established process. It's existed for quite a while. And to do it by executive action could face legal challenges. And it also, Tanya, suggests something else, which I think is worth discussing amid the president's heavy emphasis on immigration. And that is this. Yes, he has achieved some money for a wall on the southern border, but it's nowhere near as much as he needs or wants. He hasn't changed the laws on asylum. He hasn't changed the laws on the visa lottery. He hasn't changed the laws on so-called chain migration. All of those items, the president has said for months he wants to change. And even with the Republican Congress, he hasn't been able to do that. He hasn't even been able to advance that noticeably at all. Now, when the president takes a stage here in a few minutes, he'll say it's because I can't get any Democratic votes. Well, when you accuse the opposition party of wanting to have open borders, have criminals, thugs, human traffickers, drug dealers run rampant through the streets of America, well, that's not exactly the opening bid to create a bipartisan agreement or compromise. So as the president focuses on immigration, it must also be pointed out that his agenda, articulated by his administration in concert with a theoretically supportive Republican Congress, has not advanced nearly as far as the president would like.
It's a very good point you're making there, Major. I want to ask you, though, about those troops again, because we did hear before that the president would authorize the use of lethal force by the military at the border if the migrants throw rocks. First of all, is that legal? And second, could that sort of tough talk backfire on the president?
Well, there's a good legal question there, because there is a statute that prohibits the U.S. military, unless there is a declaration of an invasion, from using its military force in what is traditionally a civilian or non-militarized government action, like border control or Border Patrol or Immigration Customs. They're the lead agencies. And that's why Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, has been very clear when he has spoken to reporters and when the Pentagon has briefed about what the military will do. We're there to support Border Patrol and Immigration Customs and Enforcement. We are not there, according to the Defense Secretary, to engage or militarily challenge those migrants should anything arise. And let's also remember, Tanya, the caravan, the closest one, is weeks and weeks away. So this isn't something that's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 days, if anything happens at all. But the president saying, hey, lethal force can be used if they throw rocks. Well, based on the briefings the Pentagon has provided, military personnel in supporting roles would be a good distance away from the border, not right on top of it. So you'd really have to throw a rock a really long way to engage the military under what the president said today. It is part of this rhetoric, though, of supersized strength on the border that may not have ever any practical application.
It may be more theatrical than anything else. All right, so Major, I do want to ask you about the new campaign ad that you mentioned. The president tweeted the video Wednesday night, of course, doubling down on his anti-immigration rhetoric. What do we know about the origins of this video?
Well, I can tell you this. Back during the very short-lived government shutdown, the Trump campaign used that particular individual, Luis Bracamontes, in an ad saying Democrats were sympathetic to those who would allow illegal immigrants who could become criminals into the United States. This web ad is much harsher, much more direct, much more accusatory. And look, the Bracamontes case is horrific. He killed police officers, and he bragged about it. That's a terrible thing, and a violent criminal of any kind, undocumented or an American citizen, is a threat to public safety. That's a fact. But the ad does what the president did during the shutdown, using the Bracamontes case, and again now, using Bracamontes as a symbol of those who enter the country or seek to enter the country without documentation. And plenty of Republicans and plenty of Democrats, for sure, and many immigrant rights activists say that is a degree of exaggeration that borders on slanderous, libelous, and toxic. That you are essentially saying anyone who might wish to enter the country without documentation is, in all likelihood, the worst kind and the scariest kind of criminal imaginable. That is the sort of reductionist politics involved in a web ad like that. Does it find receptivity? Yes, it does. Is it in all cases or even half the cases true? No, it's not. But it is a political weapon this president has unsheathed yet again in the final days of this midterm campaign, much as he implied during the 2016 election and for a moment or two used during the government shutdown to highlight this issue.
And it appears to be his favorite political weapon, at least at this moment. Major Garrett, thank you.
Thank you.